This video will cover the nasal bones, the zygomatic bones, also known as the cheekbones, and we'll talk about the construction of the orbit. So let's start with the nasal bones. Here is a figure from Gray's Anatomy. It nicely isolates the nasal bones by colorizing them. And there's not much to say about the nasal bones, and they're fairly simple. They're oblong in shape and they're paired. And if we turn to this figure, another nice figure from Gray's, nasal bones are going to be found under the bridge of the nose. So here is where you would find the bridge of the nose. And the nasal bones also contribute to the upper third of the dorsum of the nose. So if we're talking about the external anatomy and talking about the nose specifically, there's anatomy to be discussed here. Some of it's not associated with the skull, but rather is associated with the fact that we also have pieces of cartilage that add to the anatomy. The lower two-thirds of the nose is supported by cartilage, and then at the very end we have what is called the tip of the nose, which is pretty straightforward. If you want to get more fancy, we can refer to it as the apex of the nose. And there's a lot more you can just say about the cartilages that support the external anatomy, but we'll move on. The zygomatic bone is going to contribute to the formation of the orbit, but other than that, there's not much to say about it. There is a foramen that you may find in the zygomatic bone, and it's very small. It allows for a nerve and some blood vessels to go through the skull. But as I said, it's so small that very often you won't see it. You won't even see it in actual skulls. And in this plastic model, it's not apparent at all. If it were present, it wasn't picked up in the mold. And this has a name that is all out of proportion to its importance. Of course, it's a very large name. This foramen is referred to as the zygomaticofacial foramen. And if we want to see it, the best way we can look at it is by looking at some figures. So if you look again at Gray's Anatomy, it is illustrated in this picture, and here it is right over here. Another process that we should note that is associated with the zygomatic bone is the temporal process. And the temporal process is called the temporal process is because it's going to join up with the zygomatic process of the temporal bone to give you the zygomatic arch. Here is another figure that illustrates the zygomaticofacial foramen. And here again we have the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. And here is the zygomatic arch. Now let's look at the orbit. Let's first consider the openings inside the orbit. You have the superior orbital fissure, which is an opening between the lesser and greater wings of the sphenoid bone. And then between the maxillary bone and the greater wing of the sphenoid bone, you have the inferior orbital fissure. Over here on the medial side of the orbit, there is the opening of the optic canal, through which cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve, goes through. Now let's look at the bones that make up the orbit. We have, on the lateral side, we have the zygomatic bone. Inferiorly, we have the maxilla, also known as the maxillary bone. We have on the lower medial side the lacrimal bone. Then here is the sphenoid. We have the ethmoid on the medial side. Superiorly, we have the frontal bone. And finally, you can't really see it looking at this skull, but there is a small contribution from the palatine bone. So there we have it. These are the 7 bones that are going to come together to make up our orbit. Here is a figure of the skull that nicely illustrates each of the bones that make up the orbit by colorizing each. So let's go through the bones again using this figure. So again, we have our zygomatic bone, Then we have our maxilla, our lacrimal bone, our sphenoid, the ethmoid bone, the frontal bone, and now finally we can see the palatine bone. Again, its contribution is rather small. Again, if you'd like to take a quiz, there is a link provided below in the description. Here are the image attributions. I used some nice figures from Gray's Anatomy again, in addition to a figure from OpenStax. Here is Apollo after I've asked him to help me, and you can see his reaction. He turns away and pretends that he doesn't hear me. Then he turns in the other direction, yawns, and then walks away. Reminds me of my students.